Hi, thanks for tuning in to Jamie Elmer Yoga. I'm Jamie, and today we'll be workshopping the lower leg alignment and placement in downward facing dog, and whether or not your heels are designed to actually reach the floor in downward facing dog. Now, every area in our body is connected, so what our lower legs are doing really affects the upper leg and the hips and our spine, our shoulders, all the way down to our hands. But we could spend days workshopping downward facing dog. Today we'll just be focused on the lower legs, from the back of the knee all the way to our heels and what's called your Achilles. So one of the things that we want to be really clear about in downward facing dog is that getting your heels to the mat is not the priority. That may or may not happen in this lifetime. It may or may not happen in 10 lifetimes. Because of your strength, because of your flexibility, and largely it depends on whether or not your ankle joint is designed to what's called dorsiflex to that degree. So I'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. But first, I feel and notice that so many students and so many teachers don't really know the priority in each pose. And if we don't know the priority in the pose, then we don't really know what we're supposed to be focused on in the pose. And to be really clear, downward facing dog, the physical priority in this posture is to lengthen our spine. So your heels may or may not touch the ground, and that's fine, as long as we're going for a long spine. So that's number one. That's really what we're looking for in this pose. And we need to adjust the hands and we need to adjust the feet in order for us to lengthen our spine in down dog. That's the priority. So oftentimes students will say things to me, or I'll hear them say things to their teacher like, I've been practicing this pose now for 10 years and my heels are still way up away from the floor. And that's fine. Their lower leg and their calves, their Achilles, their ankle joint may or may not be designed for their heels to touch the floor. So just keep that in mind, that getting your heels to the mat in down dog is not necessarily one of our main priorities. So a brief little anatomy tutorial to start. Our hamstrings, which oftentimes people really focus on stretching their hamstrings, when it's their calves, meaning the back, lower leg, and Achilles, that needs a little bit more attention and focus in terms of stretching. So oftentimes people are focused on their hamstrings. Hamstrings run from your sitting bones, the base of your pelvis, down the back of your leg, and attach to your lower leg to the back side on either side below your knee. So your hamstrings cross two joints. They cross the hip joint in the back, in a sense, and they also cross the knee joint in the back. So your hamstrings may be tight high up at what's called the origin, where they start. They may be tight at the belly of the muscle, or they may be tight near the insertion where those hamstrings insert to the back lower leg. Your hamstrings may not be tight. It doesn't have anything to do with strength or weakness. And for most of us, our hamstrings are tight in one of those three areas more than the other. So just know that when you start to straighten your knees in any forward fold, standing or seated, or when you start to straighten your knees in downward facing dog, your hamstrings are being asked to stretch. Your hamstrings are being asked to lengthen. So if you feel tightness or a stretch behind your knee on either side where those insertions are, then that's a pretty good indication that your lower hamstrings may be tight. Now, what could cause this tightness? Simply not stretching your hamstrings could cause them to be tight. Some of it's genetic. And also, if you spend your day with your knees bent, if you sit for a good amount of your day, your hamstrings are actually living short behind your knee. They're not necessarily strengthening, but if you sit for a good amount of your day where your knee is bent, your hamstrings, the lower hamstrings, will tighten just from the simple angle of that joint being bent in what's called flexion. So most people have some tightness behind their knee in their lower hamstrings, simply because we sit a lot and our knees are bent throughout the day. So that's one factor. So if the lower hamstring is tight, it won't allow the heel to reach down towards the floor in downward facing dog. Now, secondly, In the lower leg, in the back, you also have a few other key players in terms of the muscles that may be keeping your heels from reaching the floor in down dog. Those muscles are, one, your gastrocnemius, and that is a large calf muscle, and your gastrocnemius runs from above your knee on the back, at the bottom of your femur, your upper thigh bone, runs behind your knee, and then inserts via the Achilles tendon. The gastrocnemius actually becomes the Achilles tendon and inserts into our heel. So that Achilles tendon is actually that real tendinous tendon that you can see just above your heel. So your gastrocnemius runs again from the back of your upper leg here, above your knee joint, down to the back of the knee joint, creating your calf, and then via the Achilles tendon into your heel. So again, if you sit for a good amount of your day with your knees bent, the top of that gastrocnemius muscle is not strengthening by that knee bend, but it is getting tighter. And then you have another muscle called your soleus. And the soleus starts below the knee on the back lower leg and also combines with the Achilles tendon to insert into our heel. So if any of those muscles are tight, the lower hamstring, the gastrocnemius, your soleus, i.e. your Achilles, those muscles being tight won't allow the heel to reach down towards the floor in downward facing dog. Now, the other piece that's really important in this equation is we can do so much with our soft tissue, meaning stretching and strengthening our muscles, but we can't do much about and shouldn't try to force the structure of our joints. So if you sit down, and you can do this with one leg or both. If you sit down and flex your ankles, so that means pull your toes back towards your shin or towards your nose. When you flex your ankles, there's muscles and tendons on the front top of your foot, front of your ankle, front of your shin that work to pull your toes back towards you. And then all of those muscles that I just mentioned have to lengthen and stretch to a certain degree in order for you to pull your toes back. So on the front side of your shin and the front top of your ankle, those muscles and tendons have to work in order to create that action of flexion, and muscles on the back side of your calf and Achilles have to stretch and lengthen in order to flex your ankle. Now technically, this is called dorsiflexion. I usually just describe it as flexing your ankle. So the muscles are working on the front side, lengthening on the back side. But then regardless, again, of your strength or flexibility in these muscle groups, your ankle joint, the bones of your foot, all the little bones of your ankle and your lower leg bone, the shape and the size of that joint will really determine how much range you have in dorsiflexion. So if you sit here and just dorsiflex your ankle and pull your toes, the top of your foot back towards your shin, towards your nose, and your foot only gets to there, part of that may be weakness in the front of the shin, and part of it may be tightness in the back lower leg, and part of it may be that your ankle joint, the structure of your joint, is not designed to dorsiflex any more than that. So we can strengthen muscles, we can stretch muscles to a certain degree, and we're actually all designed to stretch and strengthen to varying degrees, but we really can't change how our joints are put together. So someone may strengthen the front of their shin and stretch the back lower leg their entire life and still only get to a certain degree of range of flexion. Whereas someone else may do the same amount of stretching, may do the same amount of strengthening, do the same exact exercises for the same amount of time, and they get more range of movement in that joint because their actual structure, the bones, are designed to move into a greater range. So it's really important to keep in mind in every single pose that we can strengthen, we can stretch, and at the end of the day, we are structurally put together, our bones, our joints, in very different ways, and our joints are only designed to move to a certain degree. So, with that said, in downward facing dog, you know now that your priority in the pose is to lengthen your spine. And then whether or not your heels touch the floor or not will really vary from person to person. And what I'll introduce to you today is the fact that oftentimes we think that it's just generally our hamstrings that are tight. So many people feel like, oh, I've got tight hamstrings. I just need to do more forward folds. That may or may not be true. Oftentimes, it's not our hamstrings that are really the tightest place in the back of the leg, but it's the calves. It's the lower hamstring, perhaps. And then those muscles I mentioned, your gastrocnemius, your soleus, and your Achilles tendon that need to stretch more. And what I find is that when students think they have tight hamstrings, and their heels are off the floor in downward facing dog, by stretching their calves and their Achilles, their heels are then able to lengthen down towards the floor more, and it had nothing to do with their hamstrings. So again, that's a whole other topic, hamstrings and spine length. Still just trying to focus on the lower leg. So first, I'd like to introduce to you how to come into downward facing dog so that your hands and your feet are a good distance apart. Because in down dog, if you bring your hands and your feet close together, most everyone at some point will be able to get their heels down, right? So that may or may not be the best structure for the rest of the body. So this is a really good measuring off point for how far apart you want your hands and your feet in downward facing dog. So bring your big toes fairly close together. Have your knees hip width or shoulder distance. And then stretch your hips back towards your heels. And obviously this measuring off only works if you can get your hips back fairly close to your heels. Stretch your arms forward. And now take your hands a little bit wider apart than you think shoulder distance is. Spread your shoulder blades. And as you gently reach your hips back towards your heels, your forehead may or may not touch the mat. You want to straighten your elbows here so that your forearms lift up away from the mat, so the arms are really firm and active. And now slide your shoulders onto your back. So your shoulder blades come out of your ears. Slide your shoulders onto your back so you give yourself a nice long neck. Now, if your elbows are straight and your shoulders are on your back, this is really the place that we want to begin to measure off from down dog. So shoulders are out of the ears, elbows are straight, forearms are lifting up away from the floor. Keep your hands exactly where they are as you come up onto your hands and knees. Now, most people walk their hands in when they get to this spot. Don't move your hands. That's key. And then curl your toes under. Lift your hips up and back to downward facing dog. And just notice how far apart from front to back your hands and your feet are. So depending on how you're used to practicing down dog, this may feel long apart from hands to feet, or it may feel like a shorter down dog. No right or wrong here, just notice. And then notice, peek back at your heels, and just notice how close your heels are or are not to the mat. And now come back down onto your knees, sit your hips back into child's pose, and we'll do that one more time, just so it's very clear the distance between your hands and your feet. So, knees are about shoulder distance. Stretch your hips back towards your heel. Stretch your arms forward. Have your hands a little bit wider than shoulder distance. Spread your shoulder blades apart. Lift your forearms and your elbows up away from the mat and slide your shoulders onto your back. Now keep your hands exactly where they are as you rise up. Don't walk your hands closer to you. Curl the toes under, lift your hips up and back to down dog. And this is a good measuring off distance of where to place your hands and your feet, the distance between your hands and your feet. Now, again, peek back at your heels, and if your heels are up away from the mat, just take a little mental note of how far your heels are up away from the mat. So take a little mental picture of that. And now walk your hands back to your feet. Bring your hands to your hips. Come on up. And I'll introduce you now to a calf stretch that will probably change that distance of how high your heels were up away from the floor. Again, oftentimes if the heels are up and down dog, it's not about the hamstrings, but sometimes it's about the lower hamstring. And more importantly, and more often, it's about the calves needing to stretch and lengthen. So you'll come to the wall, any wall, and just place your fingers or the palms of your hands on your wall. I'm starting with my feet just about a foot back away from the wall, and then step 1 foot back. So coming into a little kind of a lunge here. You bend forward into your front knee and try to have both feet straight forward so that all 10 toes face forward. If you're familiar with the pose Warrior 1, it's different than Warrior 1. My back foot is not turned out. Try to have all 10 toes face forward. So you bend forward into your front knee, and you want to firmly be able to press your back heel down. So if you don't get any stretch here, then go ahead and walk your back foot further back. Take a few breaths. Notice that my pelvis here is hinging forward. My upper body, my spine is hinging forward. Just try to relax in your upper body. And you want to feel here as if you have to reach a little bit to get that back heel down. Now think of lifting your back toes up away from the mat so that you're using muscles on the top of that foot, the front of your ankle, and the front of that back shin in order to reach your heel down. So remember, we're strengthening the muscles on the front side of the ankle so that we're lengthening the muscles on the back side of the ankle. And just notice where you get a stretch. It could be behind your knee. It could be in the belly of the calf. It could be in your Achilles. Or a little bit in all of those areas. And now step your back foot forward and change sides. Again, try to have your feet straight. Now remember that I mentioned the structure of our joints. If you feel compression or tightness or any pinching in the front of that back ankle, then that may mean that that's really the end range of how much your joint wants to flex. So I would suggest then that you back off a little bit. Again, lift the toes of your back foot. So you're using the muscles on the front of the shin in order to reach your heel down. And just try to relax in your upper body. Take a couple more, just easy breaths here. And I can't tell you how many times I have given students the homework to do this stretch before their practice. It'll change your forward folds. It'll change your down dog. And then step that back foot forward. Come back to your mat. Have your feet so they're about hip distance. Hands to your hips. Inhale, lift your chest. Exhale, hinge forward. Now walk your hands forward. So we're just passing through down dog here. And then come down onto your knees. Take your little measuring off from child's pose again. Stretch the arms forward. Straighten your elbows. Shoulders onto your back. And then rise up onto your hands. Keep them exactly where they are. Curl the toes under and lift your hips up and back to downward facing dog. Now do the same work here in the front of the shins and in your toes. Try to lift your toes up. Try to work the front of your shins. Those muscles are contracting, strengthening in order to reach your heels down. And just remember, your heels may or may not touch here, and that's not the point, is to get them to touch. Keep breathing, few more breaths. Lift your toes in order to reach your heels down. And just notice that after doing that calf stretch, your heels may reach the mat a little bit more. Or they may be a little bit closer to the mat, even if it's just a half an inch or a millimeter. Take one more inhale and exhale. And then lift your heels, come down onto your knees. to sit again. All right, so a couple of things there. First, notice if your heels were closer to the floor after doing that calf stretch. For most people, doing that calf stretch will lengthen the back of the leg enough, the lower leg, to get the heels down towards the floor a little bit more. And then remember, when you're thinking of reaching your heels down, you want to do it by lifting the toes and contracting, working the muscles in the front of the shin. So one side of the joint is working while the other side is lengthening. And again, your heels may or may not touch the ground, but that's not the point. The point is to work the front of the shin and to stretch the back lower leg. And when we're talking about stretching any area of the body, it's usually more effective to stretch one side at a time. So you may be wondering, what's so different about that stretch than just taking a forward fold or down dog? And when we stretch one side of the body at a time, it's usually a little bit safer and easier in our body, specifically our lower back. And it's usually more effective so that we have one side of the body that's stretching and one side of the body that is stabilizing. And that goes for stretching your hamstrings too. So if you're trying to stretch your calves or your hamstrings, take a stretch that is one side at a time. And for those of you that are teachers, this is a really great thing to do once in a while in your classes, and remind people that their spine is the physical priority in the pose. Lengthening the spine is the physical priority. And then have them take a little mental note, how close or how far their heels are away from the floor. Have them do that calf stretch, which will stretch lower hamstring, gastrocnemius, soleus, and Achilles if those areas need stretching. And then bring them back into down dog, measure it off as I did from child's pose, and see if they notice a difference in the how far their heels are away from the mat. And I would say 9 out of 10 people notice a difference, because most people have tight Achilles, most people have tight calves, and most people have tight lower hamstrings from either not stretching them or not using their feet a lot or sitting for a lot of the day, which will tighten behind the knee. All right. So takeaways from here: measure off downward facing dog from that child's pose with the arms straight and the shoulders on the back. And then keep the hands exactly where they are as you rise up to move to down dog. And know that that will change a little bit over time. There's certainly times when I have people bring their feet and their hands closer together. And there's certainly times where I have people bring their hands and their feet longer apart, depending on how that affects their spine. So this is just the child's pose is just a good measuring off point for that. And then incorporate into your life that calf stretch at the wall. Before class is great. Do it in class, have people notice the difference, and it'll really change people's experience of downward facing dog. And the benefit of heels touching the floor, touching the mat in down dog at some point, maybe, is that it allows people to use their legs more. And so often in down dog, it's where people are overusing their upper body and underusing their legs. So if the opportunity is there, if the joint is designed for that much dorsiflexion in the ankle, being able to get the heels to the mat in down dog is great, because it allows us to then engage and strengthen and use our legs more in the pose. And that can just only help to lengthen the spine, right? So stretch your calves, stretch your Achilles, and I'll be back with more of these short tutorials on different aspects of downward facing dog. But start with this one, see how it goes for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can contact me through my website, jamieelmeryoga.com. I also have other longer tutorials available for download on my website, jamieelmeryoga.com. Just go to the store page. And to put everything that we just did today into practice, into your yoga practice, check out my membership site. You can find it at jamieelmeryoga.com. And it's a streaming yoga video membership site with dozens of classes and dozens of categories and a lot of content that is that can help you in your practice. Okay? So stay in touch, stay tuned. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Like the videos that you find helpful. Feel free to share them. And I will see you again soon.